Hello there, you 10 awakening wonders. Do you ever worry that you're being supplied with misinformation and disinformation? Well, fret no longer because the government is here to tell you what's true and what's not. And then they'll stop you from seeing anything that's not true. Thank you, government. About a month ago, the Labor Party released their exposure draft bill titled Communications Legislation Amendment Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill, or the MisDis Bill for short. You may be wondering, what's an exposure draft bill? Well, a bill is something that obviously gets presented to Parliament, politicians vote on it. If it passes, it becomes a law or an act. If it gets voted down, it disappears. A draft bill is where politicians introduce a bill to the House of Representatives. They poke holes in it, suggest amendments, add prefixes to it, whatever they might do. Then it comes back as a bill, gets voted on, becomes a law, a bill, or an act, or it gets voted down. An exposure draft bill is one step prior to that, where they release it to the public, you and I. We get to poke holes in it, make suggestions, amendments, that sort of thing. Then it becomes a draft bill, then it becomes a bill, then it becomes voted on. This proposed bill seeks to put an end to mis and disinformation by holding online social media platforms like YouTube or Facebook or Twitter accountable for the information that is on their platforms. Okay, so here's the actual exposure draft. Here's its full title, Communications Legislation Amendment, Combating Mis and Disinformation Bill 2023. It doesn't have a number yet because it's an exposure draft. It's a bill for an act to amend the law relating to communications and for related purposes. So here's the simplified outline of this schedule. It's not very interesting. I'll read it briefly, the important parts. ACMA, which stands for the Australian Communications Media Authority, has a graduated set of powers in relation to misinformation and disinformation on certain kinds of digital platforms. The ACMA may make digital platform rules requiring digital platform providers to keep records and report to the ACMA on relating matters to mis and disinformation. All bills start off with their definitions. It's an important part. So here they've defined access and what it means, content. I'd like to point out here that they're extremely specific and clear as to what falls within the purview. No room for ambiguity or clever lawyers to come up with some sort of, well, you said content, but, visual images doesn't count as content. Yes, it does. See Part D, whether in the form of visual images, animated or otherwise. So we're talking your GIFs and your memes, all right? That could be mis and disinformation, according to this. Excluded content for misinformation purposes. This is interesting. Content produced in good faith. So if it's produced in good faith for the purposes of entertainment, parody, or satire, it's excluded. Now, produced in good faith is rather ambiguous, allowing room for interpretation when convenient. Because what's in good faith? Is the content I'm producing right now in good faith? I mean, is good faith in terms of informing you, my audience? Professional news content. Why would they exclude professional news from rules governing mis and disinformation? Why should professional news be allowed to spread misinformation without recompense, whilst the rest of us can't? Now, the next thing they need to define is harm. Harm, in this case, means any of the following: hatred against another group in Australian society on the basis of ethnicity, nationality, race, gender, sexual orientation, age, religion, or physical or mental disability. Disruption of a public... Wait, that's nine different groups that we can think of in Australia. Harm to the integrity of Australian democratic process or of Commonwealth, state, territory, or local government institutions. Harm to the health of Australians. Harm to Australians' environment. Economic or financial harm to Australians, the Australian economy, or a sector of the Australian economy. I can't think of a piece of information that couldn't be considered harm under these parameters, given the powers of interpretation that individuals possess. If I was a malicious actor within this bureaucracy, I could construct an argument that anything I saw online was harmful. And if you've got an example of something you can point to that you think could not be misconstrued as harm, I would actually like to hear it. Post in the comments below. Private message. Now they've clearly defined what a private message is. It means an instant message sent using a digital platform service from one end user of the service, the sender, to another person. So essentially, if it's an end-to-end user messaging service, that's what they're talking about with a private message. You'll find out later on that private messages are excluded from this. So private messages can't be regulated, though the wording on group messages is a little ambiguous. Part 6. Excluded services for misinformation purposes. For the purpose of this schedule, the following services are excluded for misinformation purposes. An email service, a media sharing service that does not have an active feature, a digital platform service specified by the Minister in an instrument under subclause 2. Now, obviously, it's a necessary exclusion to exclude emails, but consider how convenient it is for politicians. Was this an act of trust towards the citizens or necessary protections for those in power? The Minister may, by legislative instrument, specify that a digital platform service is an excluded service for misinformation purposes. Rather convenient that at any time a selected politician may exclude a digital service from the rules that govern all digital services. I can think of situations where government may want special treatment and a quid pro quo is established, much like Twitter with the United States government prior to Elon Musk taking over. Misinformation and disinformation. For the purposes of this schedule, disinformation of content using a digital service is misinformation on the digital service if the content contains information that is false, misleading, or deceptive. Now, the question is not so much what is true and what is not, but who gets to decide. For the purpose of this schedule, in determining whether the provision of content on a digital service is reasonably likely to cause or contribute to serious harm, have regard to the following matters. Another example where government powers of discern are broad. Plenty of wiggle room for a bureaucrat to say, yes, this here is an egregious example of serious harm, or no, whilst this is similar to that, and on a different platform that we happen to favour, we do not regard this as serious harm. Interesting that they've given themselves room to move in that regard, which is not afforded to you and me. Division 2. Record keeping and reporting. The ACMA may make digital platform rules in relation to records. The digital platform rules may require a digital platform provider to make and retain records relating to the following: misinformation and disinformation on the service. Well, why do they need to make a record of it? How long does the record last? Will it or can it ever be expunged? I imagine 30-year-old records will start to appear and be leaked to the media as left-of-field political candidates start to make too much unexpected headway, with the masses threatening to disrupt decades-long lasting political party duopoly. Before the ACMA makes a digital platform rule for the purposes of this clause in relation to a digital platform service, the ACMA must consider the privacy of end users. Must consider privacy of end users. That's concerningly unconstraining. Well, as long as you have to consider it and you tick that box, it doesn't matter what your outcome is. You know, stand before a jury of your peers and say, did you consider their privacy before you violated it? Yes, we did. All right, well, I guess you met your obligation. Be on your way. Incorrect records. So this part is about supplying records. Now, the interesting thing here is, well, what's the definition? First of all, the person does so knowing that the record is false or misleading. So if you have to supply records to the ACMA and you omit any matter or thing without which the record is misleading, the penalty is 100 penalty points. Now, what's a penalty point? We have to refer to this other document here. You can already see the answer here. 100 penalty points equals $27,000. How did I come to that conclusion? If I come over to this, I'll flick to the top. This is the Communications Legislation Amendment Combating Misinformation Disinformation Bill 2023 fact sheet. The interesting thing is right here. Maximum penalties, non-compliance, I did the math. 1 point is equal to $275. Crazy amount. And in some instances, they're able to give you a $2.75 million fine. Well, corporations. Which means corporations are going to comply with this. They'll probably be over compliant because they'll be too scared to get a $2.75 million fine. $6.8 million over here for non-compliance with the industry standard. Division 3, Information Gathering. ACMA may obtain information and documents from digital platform providers. This is what I was talking about. This clause applies to a digital platform provider of a digital platform service if the ACMA has reason to believe the provider has information or a document that's relevant to a matter mentioned in subclause 2. The ACMA considers that it requires the information if documents are evidence of for the performance of the ACMA's function under paragraph blah blah blah. Basically, what it's saying is if they think they need it, you're required to give it to them as a service provider. However, a notice cannot require a person to give information that would reveal the content of a private message. So private messages should be protected. And you can see I've written here, I may be cynical for thinking that they haven't done this for my benefit, but you may be naive for thinking that they haven't done it for theirs. If the ACMA is satisfied that a digital platform provider has contravened subclause 5, the ACMA may issue a formal warning to the provider. So they've just given themselves some leeway. They don't have to issue a fine every single time. They can give you a warning. I wonder how many warnings they can give you. Section 20, copying documents and reasonable compensation. So this simply says that if they require you to supply documents, YouTube, Twitter, whatever it might be, ACMA is required to compensate you for supplying those documents. You can't just demand that somebody print off 20,000 pages and expect that 20,000 pages is free somehow. Self-incrimination. Now this is particularly interesting. An individual is not excused from giving information or evidence on the ground that giving the information or evidence might tend to incriminate the individual in relation to an offence. You're required to do the prosecutor's job for them. Giving false or misleading evidence. So if YouTube tries to cover for you by omitting some evidence, they could face 12 months in jail. Section 33, examples of matters that may be dealt with by misinformation codes and misinformation standards. Here's some examples. Here's one, supporting fact-checking. Now, you may not know this, but Meta, as in the parent company of Facebook, pays $800 per explanatory article for up to 50 articles per month for a maximum monthly total payment of $40,000 to RMIT University. Right, so that's within their contract. Division 5, Misinformation Standards. Subdivision A, Determination of Standards. General requirement, consideration of freedom of political communication. Freedom of speech. Before determining a standard under this division, the ACMA must consider whether the standard would burden freedom of political communication. As long as they consider it, then they can move ahead. If so, whether the burden would be reasonable and not excessive, having regard to any circumstances the ACMA considers relevant. Right, so political speech is and should be the most protected form of speech. It is in the US and it also is here and in the UK and in Canada. Any modern Western developed country, the most protected form of speech is political speech. All other speeches are below that in terms of importance. But I don't think they're talking about my political speech in this instance. I think that they're talking about slander and lies that major parties throw at each other once every 4 years. And I reckon if we went back and fact-checked the last 20 years of political ad campaigns, there would be a lot of misleading claims. Also, who decides what's reasonable? Hot tip, it's not you and me. Section 60. Implied freedom of political communication. Again, free speech. The provisions of this schedule and blah, 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 blah have no effect to the extent, if any, that their operation would infringe on any constitutional doctrine of implied freedom of political communication. Notice this says implied freedom of communication. In Australia, we do not have freedom of speech. It's only implied. It's not in our constitution. There is no law protecting your speech. And in fact, there are a couple I know of that directly infringe upon your freedom of speech. Digital platform rules. So this is to avoid any doubt. The digital platform rules may not do the following: create an offence or civil penalty, provide powers of arrest or detention, entry, seizure, or impose a tax. Now, to be clear, this is not talking about the ACMA. That is talking about YouTube, Meta, Twitter, right? They can't make any rules that do any of those things, okay? And that's all the interesting stuff out of this document. Now, we'll flick over here and just briefly go over the interesting parts from the quick fact sheet, right? So if you can't be bothered reading all of that, and I suggest you don't because it's really boring, just go to the fact sheet and peruse this because it's only like a few pages instead of 60. So misinformation, disinformation, this is what they are trying to get at. This is not the law, but this is what they're trying to do, right? Misinformation is, and then it's got some descriptions there, right? Serious harm. If you want to know what serious harm is, here's some types of harm. Now, this is not particularly insightful. It doesn't give clear definitions, it gives some pretty average examples. But here's something that I thought was interesting: misinformation about a group of Australians inciting other persons to commit hate crimes against that group. Well, we already have laws for that. And I don't think that inciting somebody else is the best grounds to write legislation on. If somebody else goes and commits an act of violence, well, then we prosecute that person. This would be akin to someone drink driving and then blaming the alcohol. We don't blame the alcohol. We blame the person. And the same for someone if someone's incited by somebody else. I mean, could somebody misconstrue what I'm saying here as inciting violence? I don't think so, but I think a clever lawyer could make that argument. The powers would not apply to SMS and MMS, so texts are somewhat safe. Um, but interestingly, ABC iView is also exempt, and so is other like Netflix and mainstream media. So why does the government news broadcaster like ABC get to post misinformation and disinformation? If they say something misleading, false, fictitious, shouldn't they be held accountable the same way everybody else is? Why do they get a free pass? The ACMA powers would not apply to direct private messages, such as a family group chat. But then, interestingly and confusingly, the next line is group chats open to the public on an instant messaging service will be within the scope. Okay, now, I get that there is a distinction here between a family group chat is exempt and group chats open to the public on an instant messaging service will be within the scope. But they're extremely clear in plenty of other places. They could be extremely clear here and leave out no ambiguity as to what is protected on our behalf. Okay, so the penalty, we've been over the penalty points. They are outrageous. Why risk it? I suspect companies are going to clamp down and make sure that there is no chance that they could cop one of these fines because it's just not worth it to them. The government is committed to achieving a balance that upholds the rights and freedoms of Australia. But, I haven't seen any politicians introducing legislation that reinforce the rights and freedoms of Australians. I've only ever seen politicians introduce bills that would enhance their powers and degrade our freedoms. I would love to see somebody actually walk the walk. The ACMA would have no role in determining truthfulness. Well, then who does? Okay, if it's not them, is it the politicians? Who determines what the truth is? Normally, each individual determines what the truth is through hearing different points of view, speaking to different people, collecting information from broad sources, putting it all together in your own mind, and deciding from there. That's normally how people discern the truth. As proposed in the bill, the proposed ACMA powers will not apply to professional news content. Again, why is the mainstream media excused from the same standards that apply to everybody else? If misinformation and disinformation is potentially harmful to the economy and groups of people and flora and fauna, then why does it matter what source it comes from, whether it be YouTube or 7 News? The code and standard making powers will not apply to electoral and referendum communications that are required to be authorised. Now, do they mean required morally or required legislatively? Also, why? If misinformation is bad, why should it be permitted when politicians do it? And against the law at all other times. Will voluntary codes in place before the ACMA powers come into effect be automatically replaced by the new powers? The ACMA would work with industry. Right. ACMA would work with industry. Have you ever heard of legislative capture? In 10 years' time, I reckon there will be a triopoly or duopoly because industry giants like YouTube, Meta, Twitter will have worked with the ACMA to craft code rules, and this code will slowly start to edge out any potential for competitors to enter the market. This sort of thing happens all the time, and when we all look back, we complain that politicians have been corrupted, and rightly so. But the politicians aren't experts in these industries, so they go to the industry experts. And who's the industry expert in social media? It's social media companies. So you ask them, and then guess what? They influence rules and code so that it doesn't harm them. They're self-interested, we know that. Everybody is. They're going to help craft rules that don't harm them and might not be super helpful to anybody else. It's just human nature. So, to summarise, the government, through the ACMA, will regulate social media companies to end mis and disinformation. In order to write appropriate codes and rules, the ACMA will consult with tech giants who will definitely act in their own best interest, but will hopefully not write codes and rules that will be detrimental to their smaller competitors. Private messages are exempt, but the wording on group messages could be a little bit clearer. The fines for violating these rules, both for corporations and for individuals, are massive. It's a good thing that politicians and bureaucrats are well known for being trustworthy, selfless, always acting in the best interest of the general public. So what do you think? Should politicians and bureaucrats be deciding what you can and can't see on the internet? Should they be doing more to make sure you and I don't see any misinformation or disinformation? Who's going to decide what's truth, what's lies? And how's this going to affect our day-to-day communications? There are many things that were once considered fact that are now considered fiction. Lobotomies come to mind. Lobotomies were once a staple practice in medicine, and now they'll never be practiced again in Australia. Hit me up in the comments. Links to all of this good stuff is in the description. If you want to have some sort of effect or positive change, sorry, but the time that they allocated for anybody to respond about this exposure draft has now expired. But you can always email your senator, your local representative, anybody like that. They're required to at least read your emails. Until next time, this is the Misinformation Disinformation Bill. I hope that you think about the principles that have been espoused within this policy and decide for yourself whether you think government should have this kind of power. Until next time, remember, you were born free.